Hey everybody, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Mike Gibb. I run accountsrecovery.net, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar on an update on STIR/SHAKEN, call blocking, and call labeling. At long last, the STIR/SHAKEN protocols for authenticating the phone numbers of outgoing calls is finally going into effect. This has the potential to dramatically alter right-party contact rates for the accounts receivable management industry. Today in this webinar, which is being sponsored by TCN, we have noted TCPA experts Eric Troutman and Roseanne Anderson here, as well as Jesse Bird from TCN, to discuss the implementation of STIR/SHAKEN and what it means for the ARM industry, as well as what it means for the call blocking and call labeling efforts of telephone carriers. Before introducing the panel, I did want to talk for a quick second about the accountsrecovery.net live stream. I'm putting a link in the chat for you to click on and bookmark if you haven't done so already. Every day, I'm using the live stream to rebroadcast previous webinars that I've done. So, for instance, yesterday's webinar was rebroadcast today. Today's webinar is going to be rebroadcast tomorrow. We've got about 11 hours of content every day that we're rebroadcasting on the live stream. So I encourage you to kind of keep it open and use this as an opportunity to sort of stay updated and learn and listen again to some great content from some great panelists and participants. Now, let me introduce you to today's panelists. Roseanne Anderson serves as Ontario Systems Vice President and Chief Compliance Officer. She's a licensed attorney and 30-year veteran and advocate of the banking, credit, and collection industry. She holds the Chief Compliance Officer certifications for both ACA International and RMAI. In 2020, Roseanne received the Women in Compliance International Award as Compliance Officer of the Year. Prior to joining Ontario Systems, Roseanne served as a former General Counsel, Deputy Director of Government Affairs, and CEO of ACA International. Since 2011, she has led Ontario Systems regulatory compliance efforts to ensure compliance solutions are embedded in the company's software, contact management, payment processing, and cloud solutions. Jesse Bird is a co-founder and chief technology officer at TCN, a leading provider of cloud-based call center technology for enterprises, contact centers, BPOs, and collection agencies worldwide. In his role, Jesse spearheads the software development, implementation, and execution of TCN's voice over internet protocol and call center technology while leading the company's strategic direction and global expansion. Since co-founding TCN, Jesse has played a vital role in establishing and developing what has now turned into a global multi-million-dollar technology company. Eric Troutman, a partner at Squire Patton Boggs, is one of the country's prominent class action defense lawyers and is nationally recognized in TCPA litigation and compliance. He has served as lead defense counsel in more than 100 national TCPA class actions and has litigated nearly 1,200. Sorry, we've got to get updated. 200. Are we still at 1,000 individual cases, or are we up to 2 on that?
Probably like 2 on that one, too.
2 on that one. All right. As a national strategic litigation counsel for major banks and finance companies, he also helps industry participants build TCPA compliance processes, policies, and systems, and is the man behind TCPAworld.com if you haven't checked that out. Our format today is going to be a panel discussion where hopefully the 3 panelists will do a lot more talking than I will. We encourage everybody to submit questions, and we'll get to them during the course of our conversation. To submit a question, you can do so by sending it through at the chat module or hitting the Q&A tab on your Zoom webinar control panel and sending it that way. I will tell you that if you send it through the Q&A tab, you can check a box and send it anonymously. So if you're worried about having your name associated with a question and having everybody judge you, you can do so anonymously that way. Finally, since our panel is going to be talking about compliance today, let me read the following disclaimer. This presentation is not intended to be legal advice and may not be used as legal advice. Legal advice must be tailored to the specific circumstances of each case. Every effort has been made to ensure this information is up to date. It is not intended to be a full and exhaustive explanation of the law in any area. It should never be used to replace the advice of your own legal counsel. All right, with that, I'm done talking. I'm going to hand this over to our panel. Let's start by talking about STIR/SHAKEN, what it is and why it's important to the ARM industry. And let's see, Roseanne, I'm going to let you kick us off today.
Great. All right.
So enthused.
So with such enthusiasm, right? No, thank you, Mike. Thanks for inviting me. It's going to be a fun discussion today with Eric and Jesse. Well, it certainly is a timely topic. I don't think it's so timely that the time has come and gone, notwithstanding the fact that there was a June 30th deadline for basically voice service providers to launch and execute their risk mitigation plan with regard to the launch, if you will, of calls through the network. So anyway, what we want to talk about today is Stir Shaken. It is really an offshoot of the Trace Act. It was really a directive by Congress to the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, to address robocalls, meaning at least in the mind of Congress and the parties who really drafted this Trace Act legislation in the first instance. They did not consider whether these were debt collection calls, whether they were solicitation calls, whether they were calls from friends to family, or et cetera. What they were concerned about is, are the voice service providers, the carriers, launching legitimate calls into the network or not? And in order to address that, they asked the FCC to promulgate some regulations, some rules around that effort. And what the FCC came up with, is this Stir Shaken framework, whereby voice service providers will need, effective June 30th of 2021, need to begin to sign off on calls, and basically vouching for that fact that a legitimate business is associated with this particular phone number. So Eric, Jesse, any further comments on that one?
Sure. I'll
Go ahead,
jump in.
Jesse. Yeah.
So, I mean, I would say that it's a little bit generous to say that the FCC or that Congress came up with the framework. They mandated the framework should be implemented, but Stir Shaken is really a technological solution to a problem that's existed ever since the phone was invented, ever since Alexander Graham Bell uttered those first words, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," in, believe it or not, 150 years ago. Almost 150 years ago, phone networks have never really been secured. They've only been secured in the fact that when you were connected to the phone network, you were assumed to be trusted. So as networks proliferated, that no longer became a good way to validate someone's identity, and to trust that person was allowed and authorized to make a phone call, right? But we never really got away from, if you're connected, you're trusted. That was the root of the problem. And so Stir Shaken is a framework, and it's an acronym, but I'm not even going to repeat the acronym because I think it's ridiculous. Designed to assert the identity and the authenticity of each phone call. So just as calls pass through many hands before completion, the caller, the carrier, the backcall carriers, the callee's local carrier, and the callee, it is required to make sure that that call, as it passes through each hand, has its identity verified. And Stir Shaken is a framework to verify the identity between the caller and the callee and all the touch points in between. And so that's really like the big thing that's been missing from the telephone network lately. And the reason why spoofing and spamming has been so prevalent and so ubiquitous is because there's not been a good way to validate the identity between the caller, the callee, and all the points in between.
Really good explanation, Jesse and Roseanne. I'm basically here just to learn from you folks. But the way I understand this, right, as you just laid out, it's great, Jesse, it's great. There's not one telephone network. We all think there's just one telephone network out there, right? That's not true. There's dozens of them. They're their own little ecosystem. And when a phone call comes out of one little ecosystem, which is a carrier network signal, and goes to a different little ecosystem, up until Shake and Stir, there was no way for the new ecosystem, the receiving network, to know, is this a valid transmission? Where did it come from? Who sent it? There's just no way to know. After Shake and Stir, each of those little ecosystems has to put a little digital signature on it to tell the receiving ecosystem, hey, this is valid traffic. It's coming out of a real source. Here it is. You can trust it. That way, when the receiving ecosystem, think your cell phone network that provides your cell phone service, when they receive that little phone call, it comes with that authentication so that they, your carrier service, will know that this is from a valid source. It hasn't been tampered with. It's a real phone call. Maybe not that it can be trusted. It could still be a scam call, right? But that the location of the call, the phone number is legitimate and the source is legitimate, okay? Hopefully that makes sense. That's Shake and Stir. Now, what's interesting to me, and Jesse, Roseanne, jump in here, I don't look at Shake and Stir, frankly, as something that is detrimental to the arm industry, standing alone. Now, there's other issues around deliverability that we should talk about, but shake and stir is actually a good thing because it enhances the likelihood that consumers are going to start trusting the phone network again. And that innately has the propensity, I think, to increase your connection rate, right? At least in theory. So, my take on shake and stir has always been, if you're a call center, work with a good carrier that's complying with shake and stir. The back end, of course, in terms of deliverability, is that if you are not working with a carrier that has shake and stir implemented, the receiving network, right, the ecosystem that's catching the inbound call is going to block it, right? So that's a bad thing. But if you're working with a carrier that has the shake and stir implemented, then it's not going to get blocked. It's going to go sailing through, at least on shake and stir. Now, there's a bunch of other deliverability rules we're going to talk about here in a second. So when I look at shake and stir, I'm kind of one of these guys that's like, hey, it's a good thing. I support it actually, because if you're making valid phone calls, you shouldn't be spoofing your phone number anyway. And I know you folks don't do that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I actually think that it's going to be a really, really, really good thing for the industry. It's going to be a problem. I mean, it has been a problem. It's not really a problem anymore because it's kind of in the rearview mirror for me. But in general, it's going to be a big problem. I mean, one of the things about the phone network is it's been around so long. The first telephone call, 1876. It's been around so long that it is ubiquitous. The most recent stat that I had is that 98% of all Americans have a phone number. The next closest thing is email, and it's only at about 85%. So if you want to talk to someone and you will need to communicate with someone, the most effective way or the most likely way that they will have to communicate with you is a phone number. The issue has been over the last 30 years and accelerating as we've rocketed into the digital information age and networks have proliferated, is that trust has been eroded, right? And so shake and stir will do a lot to begin to restore the trust in the telephone network. And so when someone calls, you can validate that the number is real, that it is in use, that it's not stolen. You can identify who it is that is you're calling. And so it'll make it dramatically more difficult for bad actors to escape detection or to change their tactics or to complete calls. And so by making it dramatically more difficult for bad actors to exist and to operate, it'll make it so that the phone network is more trusted and that good actors and good callers can participate on the network effectively. And I mean, yeah, that's all I got on that.
The only thing I would add to that is one of the concerns or I think disappointments is that by referring to the issue as a robocalling issue, that is frequently associated with frequency, like the fact that somebody is being called over and over and over again. And the ARM industry is particularly sensitive to that, to call frequency issues because of either a state law or the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act's restrictions on excessive calling. Now, the reason I bring that up is that while the stir shaken phase of the Trace Act certainly is going to legitimize certain calls, it does not really address call frequency. And that is left to a different rulemaking regime.
Yeah, and that's something that really should be highlighted, and Mike, and I know we're going there, but it's important, I think it's important, for everyone to understand that shake and stir is its own thing. It's different than call deliverability, default call blocking rules, 10DLC, message blocking. These are different concepts. And people get them very confused. And it's just important to keep in mind, shake and stir, you heard it from Jesse, you heard it from me, and you heard it kind of from Roseanne. Shake and stir is a good thing. It's not a bad thing, right? This is about getting phone calls to be trustworthy, right? From their source, at least. Gone are the days, hopefully, of the overseas folks stealing phone numbers that don't belong to them, that are disconnected phone numbers, right? So they're not valid DIDs, they're just disconnected phone numbers and sending a phone call from that phone number in order to try to scam Americans. Shake and stir prevents that. That's a wonderful thing, okay? That is different though from, and as far as I'm concerned, let me just say, I think Congress should have stopped and the FCC should have stopped at shake and stir, just stopped and then saw how it worked. But they didn't stop there. instead we've got default call blocking rules and a whole host of messaging now licenses that you have to obtain under 10 DLC and registration processes in order to get your messages delivered. None of which is, in my opinion, is constitutional, but we can talk through that.
Yeah. So I think that what you're basically saying is there are things that Shake and Stir does do, like it'll identify the call, it'll provide identity to the caller and to the callee, it'll validate that the number is real, that the number is in use, that the number is not stolen, it'll authenticate the caller ID number, but it won't eliminate robocalls. It won't judge the merit of the call. It won't tell you if the call is malicious, if the call is unwanted, or if the call is illegal. Just because a call is signed doesn't mean that it's legal. And it won't stop robocalls. I mean, and not all robocalls are bad. Even though robocalling, I think, is unquestionably a scourge on the American public right now. Last year in 2020, they said 4 billion robocalls monthly, which is a lot. But the vast majority of the unwanted and illegal robocalls did not even originate in the United States. And that's an important thing that people often forget, which is why a technological solution that allows people to identify the bad actors and kick them off the network is going to be much more effective than any amount of government hand wavy. Now, the government did take a critical role in pushing this forward in a timeline, because I don't think that AT&T and Verizon and the other big carriers did, but they did do a good job in pushing it forward. So,
do you think the penalties associated with, I guess, legitimizing the businesses you are describing, those that kind of take other people's phone numbers and use them for illegitimate purposes, do you think the penalties that will be placed on the carriers creates a, I guess, a heavy enough stick, if you will, that they would not want to dabble in legitimizing and an illegal type of purpose?
I don't know about the penalties, but I do know that it's going to be difficult, because the way that Shake and Stir works is I, as a caller, am going to assign the call. And then you, as the carrier who's the intermediary on that caller, is going to take that signature and verify it with a trusted source. So there are a bunch of different components that go into this. But the key to Shake and Stir, the reason why you can be trusted, is not just because I signed it and then you believe my signature. It's because there is a third party that is the trusted authority that you can go and take that signature to and say, is this verified? And so then you can identify the bad actors. And as long as the trusted authority ecosystem remains small, it's very, very easy to say, this person has issued certificates to people, and now we're just going to block them, right? And so it becomes very, very easy. Or you just revoke their certificate and you say they are signing calls that should not be signed, and you can just revoke the certificate. So it's going to be a very effective way to bludgeon. The mechanism is very analogous to when you go on the internet and you say HTTPS, you see that S, right? That stands for, that's the secure part of your connection. Now, I'm going to dumb this down a little bit, but what happens is you reach out as a browser to the bank, and the bank says, this is my certificate. Well, what your browser does is validate that against the certificate chain. And so you have an outside authority that says that is a valid certificate, therefore that this site is who they say they are. And so as long as that certificate ecosystem of those service providers are trustworthy, the mechanism is effective. And this mechanism has proved over the last 2 decades in the HTTPS that this is like a way that you can establish that trust. So it's very, very, I mean, it's not new. It's just taking technology that exists, the HTTPS handshake, and applying it to phone calls. It's a pretty effective solution.
And I mean, the penalties are clear. If you are sending a message that lacks the authentication, your message is going to get blocked, right? So if you're a carrier and you can't get any of your messages through because you don't have this framework implemented, then you're not gonna have any clients because you can't send messages. And of course, if you're a carrier that is, for whatever reason, choosing to continue to receive messages, even though they lack the authentication, the FCC can shut you down. I mean, that'll be the end of that carrier. And let's not forget that in December of last year, the commission required intermediary carriers and the actual terminating carriers to be monitoring traffic, and take steps to alert through the traceback program the originating carrier if they're carrying bad traffic. And if the originating carrier doesn't stop sending bad traffic, the intermediary and terminating carriers are required within 24 hours, according to a footnote, to shut this down, to shut it down. So, I mean, this is, just everyone needs to understand that the tools that are being brought to bear on stopping robocalls now, the technological tools, not the legal tools. The legal tools are junk. The technological tools are actually very effective, shockingly effective. And frankly, as we talk about now, default call blocking, overly effective, because it's no longer an issue of just stopping the bad calls. Shake and Stir does that. And the traceback program, in hand with traceback, with Shake and Stir, does that. Default call blocking now becomes this redheaded stepchild where it just doesn't have a place really in the new technological regime, where you've just got carriers acting unilaterally to decide what messages to block and what messages not to block, right? Blocking unauthenticated messages that lack Shake and Stir authentication, cool, you should be doing that, right? Tracing down bad actors who are scamming using the traceback program and stopping that traffic, cool, totally agree. Just using default mechanisms, quote unquote, algorithms with reasonable analytics to just decide what messages to connect or not connect, that is where the ARM industry gets caught up and gets hammered and gets labeled as scammers when they're not, gets labeled as calls that are unwanted, when highest CEO tells us like only 2% of servicing calls are actually unwanted by the consumer. It's really quite a mess out there.
I would agree with you. Reasonable analytics is about the most unreasonable phrase that I've ever heard in my life.
No, it's terrible.
Large enough to justify just about any program that they want to. And, I would say that overblocking may be one of the most troubling issues that faces the ARM industry right now. I mean, it's seemingly, maybe it's not seemingly, it's absolutely arbitrary and capricious, right? And redress is almost impossible.
It is impossible. Yeah.
And with StirShaken, I think that callers are going to start expecting a presumption of innocence when you're complying in terms of the carrier. And when StirShaken is implemented, I think that there should be a presumption of guilt if you're not complying. And how aggressively this is enforced, I think that's going to be up for debate. And that's going to be something that carriers sort of do on their own. I hope that once customers are, and StirShaken is deployed totally, that carriers aren't going to be blocking solely on the reasonable analytics. I know that on April 6th this year, the FCC published a notice, and the notice had some rules about their call blocking, right? And what is going to be expected of the carriers in regards to call blocking. So what they're going to have is they're going to have a few things. They're going to have the biggest win, I think, from that order is that carriers are going to have to start providing human oversight over their network-based blocking, and they're going to have to only target calls that are highly likely to be illegal and not simply unwanted. And I think that was a huge win in terms of what the FCC was going to be doing in regards to like how they're going to regulate this. And the biggest technological win, I think, is that the carriers are going to have to do two things. The first thing is they're going to have to notify the caller by using a SIP or an ISUP code that the call was blocked. And they can't leverage the catch-all SIP or ISUP codes. Like for SIP, it's a 503 code. And they cannot, and so like I've seen that in terms of implementing this, that some carriers, when they block these, return a 503, and the 503 is like a catch-all for everything.
Yep.
So in the order itself, it's specified that they should be using like a 608 or a 607, which is currently very rarely or never used, which will be a huge win in terms of tracking who's blocked. And then the other thing is that they need to provide a redress, and that redress needs to needs to be something that you can open a ticket with and they have to respond back to you within 24 hours. So I think that that element of human oversight will do a lot to encourage carriers to not overblock, and then the responsibility of them to return a SIP code if they are blocking is going to do a lot to enable callers and callees to make sure that their calls are, that they're getting redressed when they are being blocked.
Yeah, so that ruling actually came out December of 2020. The public notice you're referring to in April is actually, believe it or not, US Telecom reaching out to the FCC and asking it for more time, right? So the framework today is the carriers block you using reasonable analytics, right? They don't tell you that you're being blocked, and they can go on blocking you or not blocking you or labeling you, and you don't even know about it. So in December 2020, the FCC said, hey, look, that's got to stop, at least as to call blocking. Come January 2022, 6 months from now, carriers, you have to use SIP protocol to let folks know using these codes. Jesse, thanks for breaking that down. If your calls are being blocked. US Telecom filed a petition for reconsideration with the FCC, which, by the way, virtually nobody responded to, saying, dear FCC, you know, this is kind of tough. We don't really want to do that. And I'm paraphrasing here, obviously. You know, it's SIP protocol. We're still working on laying this out. The framework is hard. Give us more time. Open-ended extension is what they're requesting. Now, the commission hasn't ruled on this yet, but don't be surprised if this January 2022 date goes away.
Yeah, the current implementation date for the redress is January 1st, 2022. So on TCN side, I have been adamantly annoying any carrier that I work with about how they're going to, one, implement the redress mechanism and return to me a response in 24 hours, and two, implement the SIP or ISUP response code so that I can inform my customers that they're being blocked. And I have probably polled upwards of 30 carriers on those two questions. And I've had numerous interactions with almost every carrier that you can imagine. And not a single one of them is really ready to get on the fence and, or really ready to like get on the horse and say, yeah, we're doing this. And so I think that that's going to be, I think absent of government intervention, just like on the stir shaken thing, absent of government requirement, I would be hesitant to believe that they're going to implement something effectively.
Yeah, 100% chance that that January 2022 date gets pushed. 100% chance, 100% chance. When does it actually get implemented? I couldn't tell you. Probably a year from now at the absolute earliest. And remember, even when the rule does become effective, whenever it is, the carriers still do not have to notify you that your calls are being labeled. This is only notification that your calls are actually being blocked, okay? Again, all this is separate from shake and stir. This is a totally different regime where the carriers are empowered to do this default call blocking based upon their reasonable analytics. And the only question now is, do they even have to tell you? And if they have to tell you, is there a redress mechanism? Now, Congress has said, as part of TRACED, that it's not optional. The carriers do have to offer a redress mechanism. And the FCC has said that 3 times now in 3 different orders, but they're all very vague, right? The carriers should have a redress mechanism.
I may be a little bit more optimistic than you. I still hold out hope that it won't be pushed.
That's great. I mean, I hope, look, obviously I hope that that's true, but I'm convinced. I mean, I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I'd go all in on this. It's going to get pushed.
I'm just going to step in briefly. I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt because the conversation's been great so far and I don't want to interrupt the flow, but I did want to invite McKay Bird from TCN, the sponsor of today's webinar, to say a few words. McKay? You're muted, McKay.
There we go.
There
Thank
you
you,
go.
Mike, and as well as the panelists for making this discussion possible. As Mike mentioned, my name's McKay Bird. I'm the marketing director here at TCN and happy to be a part of this conversation and as well as sponsor today's webinar. But a little bit about TCN. We are a cost-effective call center solution for collection agencies, traditional contact centers, and as well as thousands of other businesses around the world. TCN has a product called TCN Operator, and it is a holistic cloud platform that puts everything in a single place and allows you to monitor your call center operations from anywhere. Operator is a highly customizable solution, and when that is combined with our no contract promise, it provides maximum flexibility in being able to scale your operations up or even down, depending on your business conditions. Recently, several months ago, we launched one of the most comprehensive STIR/SHAKEN resource pages. And I just invite you guys to learn more and to head over to tcn.com after today's discussion and to check out that guide, and as well as to learn more about TCN. And you can do that at tcn.com. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, McKay. Thanks again to TCN for sponsoring. I did put a link in the chat for anyone who wants to click on to get the guide, the STIR/SHAKEN guide. So I encourage you to do that. We have a few questions that have come in from the audience, so we'll take those now and use that to sort of jump the conversation back off again. And the first question is, was Shaken Stir a switch that was flipped on July 1st, or are there latency issues? What I mean is, as a consumer, how am I still receiving unknown calls per my phone's caller ID? Restoring trust, yes, great. When?
So I'll take this one real quick, and then Jesse, Roseanne chime in. You'll still get blocked calls, okay? Just because the phone call is coming with an authentication package doesn't mean that the call can't be blocked. It just means that the originating carrier has to certify through the registration process to the receiving carrier that the phone is coming from a valid source. So even if it's blocked, it's still supposed to be authenticated over the framework. And in terms of latency issues, this, the carriers have been working on this framework for months. They've known about this deadline for months. It wouldn't shock me if their analytics haven't been completely updated to block 100% of unauthenticated calls yet. But I think it's probably pretty close to 100% right now. I don't know, Jesse, Roseanne, if you have any other thoughts on that.
I don't think that any difference happened between June 30th and July 1st, to be honest. We've not really noticed, any difference, but we've been trying to get our calls signed for months. But the framework has actually been started to implement. Comcast was one of the first that started, and they started like in 2018. This has been ongoing for a very long time. So it's going to be a lot more like turning a ship than a jet ski, for sure. But it's going to be more of a spectrum. It's not a switch. It's more of a spectrum. And one of the big problems with why it's never going to be like a switch is because the framework for STIR/SHAKEN really only applies to VoIP interconnected calls. If your call traverses networks, which are legacy equipment, ISUP, SS7, that sort of stuff, they don't have a mechanism to marry those two things effectively, which is why I think that reasonable analytics will probably always play a part in it as well. But anytime that there is an all digital call or all IP based call, STIR/SHAKEN should be very, very, very effective. So, and as in terms of restoring trust, it's built up over time and it's lost all at once. And I think that it was kind of lost all at once, and now it's going to take a while to build back up. And I think that over time, the phone network will be the most ubiquitous and the most trustworthy way to communicate with someone. And I still think that it is the most trustworthy way to communicate with someone. It's just more trustworthy when you're doing the calling rather than the other person doing the calling, because surveys show that anytime you're having a high value conversation, you would rather do it on the phone than via chat. Sometimes over the phone and then confirm with email, but you almost always want to do it over the phone, especially if it's something that is important to you. So I don't think that we're going to get away from that anytime soon.
I guess what I wanted to talk, I agree with that. Fascinating conversation. What I wanted to focus on, at least for a few moments, would be if I were sitting and listening to us as a collection agency, I would want to know a few things. Number one, any carrier you are working with, voice service provider you are working with, they should have already, in my opinion, reached out to you. You should be having some interaction with your carrier, voice service provider about how are they handling their responsibility, if you will, to sign calls. Now, let me break it down this way. And we're all very, very careful to not, TCN is sponsoring this. This is TCN's webinar. Let's focus on that. But so let me just fill in the blank. When you are working with some voice service providers, they are actually providing their customers with telephone numbers they may use when placing calls into the network. Okay, they actually provide the agency, here's your list of phone numbers. We have gone through and exercised due diligence to determine, we know that you, Mr. Collection Agency customer, are a legitimate business in good standing, and we are now handing this list of numbers to you, and you may use these to launch calls, as Jesse just explained, so long as they meet this IP category, et cetera. Well, anyway, so that's one step. And for example, I know in our situation, people say, well, do we need to send you the list of telephone numbers you gave to us so that we may, so that we can tell you we're using these numbers? It's like, people are not getting it. If your carrier gave you the number, then, and they have exercised due diligence with regard to who you are, they should be able to sign off on those calls you placed using those numbers. But here's where it gets a little confusing and sticky. For example, many voice service providers in our space are allowing you, the agency, to place calls that using numbers, for example, that were assigned by a carrier to your hospital, for example, your hospital client, your telecom, not telecom, let's use it in like your whatever agency or organization you're collecting debt for. They may have already received telephone numbers in their own right. And now they for years, they may have said, oh, Mr. Agency, are you doing this in the first party mode? Are you doing first party collections? Well, if so, here's a whole string of numbers that we have had assigned to us, and go ahead and use them when placing your calls. That's really where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, at this point. For example, carriers need to know if you have the authorization from those clients to literally use those numbers that were legitimately assigned to them by someone else. Tell your voice service providers what those numbers are. Sign on the dotted line that you vouch for the fact that you are authorized to use those numbers. And that is how you will assure your voice service providers that they can sign off on those calls. Because that's where our clients are getting very, very confused. Many of them send us a list of phone numbers that they want us to sign off on, and those are the numbers we gave them. We already know those numbers are good and that you're good. It's the numbers you're using from some other source, or that you may have even received from another carrier, that we will need before we are going to initiate those calls or launch them into the network. Comments about that, Eric, Jesse?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're basically making the distinction is the attestation A, the attestation B, and the attestation C. Attestation
Exactly.
C, I think, is as good as not being attested, because you're basically only attesting the gateway. But attestation B is you're testing the customer, and the customer said that they have those numbers.
Right.
And that's kind of, I think there's going to be a lot of differing policies in the carriers as to how you can graduate a number from attestation B to attestation A. At least that's what I've been finding. And so like some carriers have different policies and procedures than others to say, like, I will sign off on this call, or I will not sign off on this call when it's not a phone number that I've provided you, and you're making this call on my network. So one of the great things about outbound networks is you've been able to, launch a call using your caller ID on a variety of outbound networks and have redundancy. And they're removing the ability to do that easily because of this attestation B to attestation A step up that is becoming difficult to get on every carrier. I think.
Are you attesting to both? Is that proprietary or anything for you to share? I mean, because I know how we're handling A and B level attestations.
Yeah. So our goal is to get everything attested to on A, but not everything that we launch on our network is attested to A yet. Right. Because there's some step ups that are very difficult to achieve with depending on the carrier, right? They have policies as varied as there are laws, I think, and we are just trying to work through it. And it's something that's very new to a lot of them, so they aren't quite sure. Their default is, well, port the number and then we can attest. That's their default. And that's not always going to be something that's workable for everybody. Okay. So I think for big carriers, like very, very large carriers, I don't think that they're going to do it. I think they'll just attest it at B and just call it good and say, forget you. So it's going to be a little bit of a mixed bag as to how that's going to work. And I think what's really going to end up happening is attestation A and attestation B are probably going to be okay, and attestation C is not. That's what I think is going to end up happening. And and we'll see how that works out. But that's my theory.
I would agree with that right now.
Mhm.
Mhm.
That's right.
Another question from the audience, going back to the topic of overblocking. Thoughts on putting power back in the telecom's hands with STIR/SHAKEN and taking it out of the consumer's hands with private call blocking apps? If a legitimate caller has been verified, even with a B-level attestation, shouldn't their call get through and not be privately labeled a spam risk call just because some threshold number of consumers had knee-jerk reactions to an unrecognized number?
Yeah. So that's a tricky one because an app like NoMoRobo, you can't stop them from installing it on your smartphone. And as long as the smartphone providers allow the ability for those apps to intercept the dialer application and block the call or label the call, I don't think that there's anything that can be done about that. And so current regulations, the way I understand them, do not reach out to those private label call blocking apps such as NoMoRobo.
So it is a very interesting question because what's going on, you're correct, Jesse, right? If you've got a private label blocker on your phone's going to do what you tell the app to do, your phone. The question is, what are other people's phones doing, right? The carriers are working with specific private label apps that are, for instance, default on the phone. But most importantly, where the private label apps really play a role is in the traceback effort, right? They are essentially reporting, right, to US Telecom in the traceback group that 1 million people or 100,000 people, whatever it is, have identified this as a fraud call. And that is resulting not so much in labeling at the carrier level, but efforts to then trace back the source of the phone call. And if you're, for instance, the one that's being reported, you might get a ticket from US Telecom as a result of these private label apps. I don't love the idea of giving any more power to the carriers than they already have, because again, this stuff is operating in a black box fashion. Nobody really knows what the formula for the reasonable analytics is. Nobody knows why calls are being labeled spam and why they're not. And it is less, I think, responsive to individual consumer response through private label apps than it is the network's own honeypots and the network's own analytics that are running. So I don't know. I struggle because I think to some degree consumer response is already kind of not taken into account to a large degree, and the carriers are already kind of operating with broad, if not complete, discretion. So part of me kind of thinks giving more power to the consumer, might be valuable, but stopping all of that, it's just important to keep in mind that these attestations, right, aren't going to change the fact that the carriers can and do block using their analytics as well, right? And that's just something that has to be kept in mind here. We can talk about attestation all day long, and that's great, right? And that's important. But at the end of the day, right, so long as these carriers have this power to use default call blocking with unfettered discretion, I mean, it's just a problem. It just, bottom line, overblocking is going to continue to be an issue, and the consumer response isn't really driving the issue.
Right. So this kind of goes back to that December 2020 order that we talked about earlier, which is not in effect yet, but it should make it clear, if it goes into effect, that a terminating voice service provider must ensure its network is targeting only calls that are highly likely to be illegal, not simply unwanted. And I think absent that, I think the carriers, you're right, are going to run with absolute impunity. But the carriers do have an economic incentive to not block too many calls because they do get paid when calls are completed.
It's interesting, Jesse. I'm going to have to go back and take a look at that order because I read it. It's been a while, but I read it differently in the sense that the carriers are mandated to block downstream traffic that is highly likely to be illegal. But I didn't read the highly likely to be illegal as a limitation on their own default call blocking regime. which is a little different. But I'll
I'm
take a
not-
look at that. It's interesting.
I'm an
'Cause-
optimistic guy, but it does say highly likely to be illegal, comma, not simply unwanted. So I'm a really optimistic guy, and I just assume the best of everybody. We'll
Yeah, well, look, the bottom line, hopefully, if you folks are listening, what you're taking away is the carriers right now have a lot of power. The extent of that power is evolving. And frankly, telecom law, I tell people this all the time. If you wrote a treatise on telecom law between 1935 and 2005, the treatise would be about that long because there was nothing. The carriers had to connect the calls. You make a phone call to your mom, the carriers connect it. You're a mob boss. You make a phone call to do a hit on a bank. The call gets connected, right? The carrier is not responsible for monitoring traffic. There was no law. Carriers had to connect calls, period. The end. That was the law of the nation for 80 years. Then all of a sudden, 2015, in the last 6 years, things are moving at light speed. And nobody, including the carriers, as you've heard Jesse say many times, nobody knows exactly what is going to happen next or how things are going to be implemented or what is supposed to happen. It's kind of the wild, wild west, and your calls are being blocked as a result. But go ahead, Jesse.
Oh, I was just going to, I would argue that the lack of oversight and regulation is the reason why the network became ubiquitous and the network became trusted. And so it's ironic that we're going to rely on the government to restore the trust and the ubiquity of the network. And I think that they could be helpful if it's a light touch. If they go too hard, I think that they're just going to degrade it. I mean, you go overseas and you wonder why everyone is using WhatsApp to talk.
Mm-hmm.
Because WhatsApp is not regulated and the phone networks are regulated to high heaven.
Yeah, I mean, all of this, though, is a product of the robocall epidemic. And rather than the Congress and the FCC figuring out one solution, they basically just threw, and just what you'd expect, right? They threw the sink at it. And so now there's a bunch of stuff operating simultaneously, but none of it that really kind of fits together right? We've talked about shake and stir. We've talked about default call blocking. We've talked about 10DLC. We've talked about traceback efforts, right? All of this stuff is operating kind of simultaneously. But to me, what always just bothers me, we haven't talked about it yet, and it's the First Amendment, right? And the law in this country has always been that as a government, you cannot delegate authority to a private individual or a lower official with discretion to decide what speech is allowed and not allowed without very clear standards, right? That's black letter law. You cannot do that. You cannot say, local magistrate, you decide who's allowed to speak using whatever terms you want to decide. That's an illegal licensing scheme. And it's exactly what the FCC has created with the carrier's ability to decide what calls go through and what calls don't go through. And that's the real problem, right? Shake and stir doesn't have that problem because shake and stir has very clear framework. If you use this, your call goes through. If you don't, it doesn't. That's black and white, right? That's not unfettered discretion. But when you talk about reasonable analytics or even a higher standard like highly likely to be illegal, that is unfettered discretion that can be used by the carrier at its discretion to decide who gets to speak and who doesn't. And we're seeing like really Orwellian stuff like trust scores being assigned to speakers, like who gets to talk and who doesn't. That's nuts. To me, that's just nuts, completely un-American. And at this point, completely unnecessary. And I get it, right? 2016, 2017, 2018, we were getting killed. There was no shake and stir. We were getting killed by calls. The FCC had to do something, and they did, and I get it. But now that shake and stir is implemented, I know the commission likes to watch my stuff from time to time. If you folks are listening, think about rolling this back. Think about rolling back the authority that the carriers have that is unfettered right now. Focus on content. Yeah, they can block spam calls, they can block illegal stuff, and they can certainly use shake and stir. But unfettered discretion, it has to go away. It's un-American, and it's a violation of the First Amendment.
And the worst, as a practical matter, what's tough about that for the the accounts receivable management industry, is we've seen this almost any issue you can raise with regard to telecommunications. well, we don't really debt collectors. We didn't realize those people were debt collectors. We don't want to process debt collection calls. It doesn't matter what, we could be talking about card processing, and that sometimes people who are ignorant do not understand how the industry functions, how it's aligned with credit issuers, et cetera. And there's just this knee-jerk reaction based on ignorance about the debt collection industry and the nature of the call. I mean, there are times when we've, whether you're discussing this with somebody, a member of Congress or the FCC, you name it, and people are just kind of mystified that, we don't generate random and sequential numbers, for example, at all. But even if we did, we're not randomly looking for people to pay debts. You know what I mean? There's just this kind of misunderstanding about the industry and about the reason for calls, and even going back to call frequency, the actual restrictions placed on the number of calls that a debt collector can make. And that's even going to be more clear when the CFPB new rules, Reg F, take effect.
Yep. I mean,
Okay.
unless we want to go back to a society where everyone prepays cash, then you need debt collectors.
Yes.
A couple of short, maybe simple questions here. Does the verification of the number work on text messages or just phone calls?
It doesn't. Just phone calls.
Easy enough. Here's maybe
There's a whole nother framework around text messaging, though. So just keep that in mind. It's not
Right.
like text messages are, you got 10DLC and you got the short code gateways. So, text is more secure, frankly, and more trustworthy, and has been for a long time, because text messages are information services and not telecommunications, according to the recent rulings. But anyway, sorry.
That's all right. This might be less easy to answer. We've had the same phone number for more than 25 years. However, several carriers have us as a robocaller, and my carrier says they can't do anything. Any suggestions?
Bug them more. Make their life a literal nightmare until they do something about it. Because the only thing that can be done is you have to bubble it up, and you have to bubble it up and bubble it up and bubble it up. Because this is why the redress is so important, and the redress requirements for response and resolution is so important, is because right now there is no effective mechanism. So the only thing you can do is be the most annoying person on the planet until they bubble it up to their carriers, and their carriers bubble it up to their carriers. And because you have a whole ecosystem of carriers, you may have to go 2 or 3 levels deep before you find the person who actually labeled you as a robocaller. But until then, you bubble it up. I have found one of the effective things is to open with that FCC order 20-187 and say, this is a requirement soon. Are you implementing it? And oh, by the way, this is our big problem. And then, it makes you look smarter, and it makes you look like you're more informed, and then they're more likely to react.
You can always get a lawyer and threaten to sue them. There's that too. But the truth is, these folks have just a ton of discretion. And I love this example because it goes to show you could have a number for 25 years, be making completely legitimate calls, and the carriers just decide to label you. And they don't have to tell you that they're doing it. And there's no redress mechanism currently in place. So Jesse's idea of just being the squeakiest wheel that ever squeaked, that works. Or you can get yourself a lawyer and start telling them that they're violating state UCL laws and otherwise defaming you, because they are. The question is, are they allowed to? I don't know.
Okay, so we've got a few minutes left. I'd like to try and spend the last that time sort of talking about takeaways. What should people who are watching, watching live or going to watch the recording, what should they be doing differently, if anything? What should they be? Who should they be talking to, if anybody? When this webinar is over and they still have to go back to their office and worry about making phone calls and connecting to the right person and making sure that phone call is connected. What should they take? What should they walk away with from this conversation, knowing or asking?
So the hard way or the easy way? The easy way.
First choice.
The easy way is talk to whoever's your technology or carrier provider and let them do it for you. The hard way is if you manage your own telecom services, then you got to be a little bit more proactive. So if you're managing your own telecom services, that's the hard way. And I would argue that it's probably not even the better way. But if you're not, your vendor should be taking care of it, and a simple email to confirm it would probably be all that is really required.
I would
Yeah.
say submit your letters of authorization regarding any numbers you intend to use that were not directly assigned to you. For example, they were, in my example, if they were not assigned to you by the carrier, you're initiating, let's put it that way, your voice service provider. They were not assigned to you. That party needs to have your letter of authorization to show that you, at least on paper, have the right to launch and receive numbers using that telephone number. That should have been submitted by June 30th, but as far as I'm concerned, there's still time because nothing is really going to seriously take effect until September 28th in terms of the voice service providers refusing to launch those numbers. But anyway, you should do that, number one. And I also think that if you have not had discussions with your voice service providers about termination codes and how they are going to be communicating new termination codes to you, I think you should make sure that you are up to speed on term codes. Eric?
Yeah, I would just say, look, if you're being targeted by unfair conduct by the carriers or by anybody else with regards to getting your calls connected or you're being labeled, don't be a victim. I mean, don't get pushed around. Don't just think you're powerless. Make noise, right? Talk to your trades. You guys should be all over ACA. You should be all over all your trades. Every single day, you should be like, what are you guys doing on this? What are you doing on this? What are you doing on this? You know, there is no petition right now pending to the FCC asking the FCC to roll back the default call blocking mechanism. None. Nobody's even asking the commission to take action on this. Why? Like, where's the noise, right? If you're being targeted, if you're being victimized, if your calls aren't going through, if you're being labeled, do something about it. Make noise. Talk, as Jesse said, talk obviously to the aggregators, talk to the carriers, talk to your platform, talk to the vendors, but talk to your trades. Agitate for change, right? Otherwise, we're just going to all put our heads down and trudge along like, you know, impotent substitute teachers that are incapable of deciding our own destinies. And that's ridiculous. Come on, folks, get it together. That's my pitch.
Well, as the image of an impotent substitute teacher, you know, conjures up in everybody's head as we walk away from this webinar, we'll use that as our cue to wrap things up. But Eric, Jesse, Roseanne, thank you so much. Everyone who's watching and listening, check out tcpaworld.com. Check out the Stir Shaking Guide from TCN. Check out Roseanne's blog. Check out her videos. She's been doing a great job, you know, sort of breaking down Regulation F and answering a lot of questions. So I encourage everybody to check those out. OntarioSystems.com, TCN.com, TCPAworld.com. Thanks again to TCN for sponsoring today's webinar. We're back tomorrow talking about Hunstein and how to defend and what the best cases are to defend against a Hunstein lawsuit. So hopefully we'll see you back for that at 1 o'clock. At 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, we've got the weekly episode of the Talk Off. So we look forward to seeing back for that. Until then, everyone, enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll talk to everybody soon. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.